Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome back. It is 11 after 8 o'clock, or rather just gone 12 after 8. Our first guest for the morning is Professor Bond, Professor Patrick Bond. He is a political economist and is also Professor of Sociology at the University of Johannesburg. Professor Bond, a very good morning and welcome to the program.
Assalamu alaikum. Very nice to be with you and the viewers there, Julie.
Walaikum assalam. Thank you indeed for your very valuable time and undoubtedly some sharp insights to the discussion at hand, and obviously is about the economic recovery for South Africa. President Cyril Ramaphosa has said that there's no longer any time for platitudes. Those days are far gone by. And they are now making a concerted and concrete effort to rebuild the South African economy following the devastation caused by COVID-19. And this, of course, is not only South Africa, it's a situation all around the world. But we in South Africa have been given a double or a triple whammy, call it what you will, because it's not only COVID-19. Just when we thought it was safe to resurface, so to speak, we had the riots in KZN, which had a horrendous rippling effect all around the country, and then the floods. Don't even talk about the corrupt politicians. So where do we stand as far as recovery is concerned? Is it doable? Is there light on the horizon? Professor.
Well, thanks so much for having me. And I think the big question you're posing is acute where I am now. I'm doing research in South Durban, hosted by the South Durban Community Environmental Alliance. So I've spent the last period really trying to figure out why so much of this city, the floodplains, especially in places like Springfield and Seacow Lake, or in South Durban, in Isipingo, in the whole industrial strip, why they're so poorly prepared and what kind of reconstruction is required, and why this huge logistics system broke down, which a month ago, with the great rain bomb, as it's sometimes called, it killed about 500 people, 435 for sure, 65 still missing. And so what can be done just to start the discussion, perhaps, with a place like this? And to me, the answer here is also the answer for the country. And that means a public works strategy. And the reason I say that, Julie, I just don't feel the private sector is committed. Now, you could see devastation economically here. The Toyota plant's a good example because it was so deep underwater in Prospecton, just on the edge of Isipingo in South Durban, that hundreds of cars were ruined as the floodwaters rose. For example, the main road that goes into the South Durban area from the city, it's Solomon Mshlangu, or Edwin Swales, the old name, the M7, and it was 2.5 meters underwater. So you can just imagine the devastation, or some of the major factories that are in that floodplain. Luckily, the two refineries here in South Durban, those are the biggest oil refineries in all of Africa, they've been taken offline. One of them, Engine, Malaysian owned, partially a South African owner, Putuma Nhlako, but they were taken offline in December 2020 because they exploded, and it's just too expensive to reconstruct there. And for Sapref, that's BP and Shell, just next to the old airport, it was taken offline, fortunately, just the very month, the beginning of April, that the rain bomb hit and really did submerge. And there could have been much worse pollution and destruction of that refinery had it actually been operating. So I think we should then think about what is the strategy. And the community groups here have a term, a just transition to rebuild places like this, but not in the old capital intensive, high machinery, and carbon intensive, high pollution mode, but with a just transition to get the workers, community, into a production system that will meet their basic needs. Since, this area used to do clothing and textiles and footwear and furniture, appliances, electronics. South Durban was full of these small factories. And because we had so much Chinese and other East Asian imports that came in so inexpensively from the 1990s, a devastation, a deindustrialization. And so an appropriate reindustrialization is on the agenda of these community groups and some of the more advanced trade unions, a genuine just transition that would take us out of the sort of circuits of reliance on exports of high carbon minerals and metals, automobiles and other of these products that now will become very vulnerable. So I think that's the critical thing, is that we learned a lot about the vulnerability of our economy, its dependence on export markets, and the high carbon intensity. And now's the chance to change it. Not that I have much hope that we will, given the mentality of those in power.
Okay, so Professor, there's just so much you've also unpacked. Let's try and break that down. So you speak about how the Chinese and Eastern imports have impacted very negatively in South Africa. Of course, they brought in very cheap products, and it truly dented our economy. Is there a chance of a revival as far as that sector of the economy is concerned? And then just stop trading with China as far as importing of those commodities are concerned. How's that going to impact on our trade relations with China? That's the one Chinese issue and cheap Chinese imports. Number two, you spoke about the Toyota plant that was underwater, totally submerged. We can't even begin to quantify the losses they have actually incurred during this time. I understand that as you and I speak, a delegation from Japan is going to be visiting South Africa to assess the feasibility of continuing that plant. And God forbid, if they should move out, if they should be taking their business away, that does mean a further blow to South Africa, our economy, further job losses. We are going to be reeling, are we not? And then again, you spoke about, let me just throw all of this at you. You spoke about SAPREF, the oil refinery. We know what's happening with jet fuel supplies. OR Tambo is reeling, another dent to South Africa and its economy. And this all has to do, obviously, with the rains, the floods in KwaZulu-Natal. So over to you on all of those issues.
Well, to take them in the backward order, as you say, OR Tambo needs jet fuel. And normally, even though there's a pipeline that was built at huge expense, over 30 billion rand was spent on a new part of the pipeline that goes from Durban to Johannesburg, a multi-product petroleum pipeline. But it doesn't carry enough of that jet fuel. So that's taken on rail. But the terrible floods washed out a great chunk of the Transnet rail system. So we're regrettably now seeing a new reliance on trucking. And it does just, again, go to show that we have too many of the imports are going to Gauteng. Gauteng as a province was important because half the world's gold at one point was underneath Johannesburg. But it's a very good chance to ask the question, if we want to really build back better, we just go back to the same patterns, and in fact, some worse patterns. Just as an example, because as you say, investment attraction is always the sort of order of the day. And will the Japanese continue to expand the Toyota plant? The big hope there from President Ramaphosa visiting last year was to change it towards more electric vehicles. There are practically none being built in this country. The very first one rolled off the line last September, but it was just more for a gimmick. So electric vehicles to combat climate change will be critical, and especially for the export markets. But our equipment, our managers, and indeed our workers just aren't equipped really to move into this part of the 21st century and do export-oriented electric vehicles, not, for example, like the Chinese can. So I think we're going to lose a lot of market share because we've had a huge subsidies, over 30 billion rand a year, going to export of luxury automobiles, the BMWs and the Mercs and all of these that are mainly going to Europe, a little bit to the US. The additional problem for those exports, and I'm sure the Japanese, investment experts understand this, it's called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. What it means, Julie, it's a climate tax, a sanctions really, a new tariff on South African exports. Why? Because our energy embedded in the exports is so carbon intensive, 90% coming from coal. Now the question is, well, if we're reducing coal, okay, maybe we move to gas, natural gas or methane gas. And maybe it'll come from Cabo Delgado, Mozambique, what we call blood methane because of the war that the South African National Defence Force is fighting there with the Rwandans against Islamic extremists who are basically alienated community people, as far as I can tell. And that war will continue, but it has allowed the SANDF, and especially the Rwandans, Total, the big French company, to start its exports, and ExxonMobil and Eni and China National Petroleum. I mean, it's such a tragedy. It reminds me of the US and the Middle East. Poor young soldiers, no future, and they're basically deployed to protect Western and Chinese oil companies. A tragedy. Now, that dilemma is, do we take that Cabo Delgado gas, or indeed do we take gas offshore South Africa? And if we replace coal with that gas, will we then escape sanctions, which start next January? The carbon border adjustment mechanism begins, although slowly, from the European Union. Then it will go to the UK, then it'll go to the US. So our major Western partners will say, hey, your carbon intensive energy embedded in your products disqualifies you. We're going to put a tax on, and you're no longer competitive. Wow. I'm pretty sure that the Japanese will be understanding that, which means going back to your first dilemma, which is, how do you get a reindustrialization when we are importing so much that's so cheap because of the bulk economies you can produce, in factories that have millions of units of output a year, when we have a very small market in relative terms. And that means we should probably look at what Ibrahim Patel says more seriously. He understands our dilemma and has said, okay, localization for some products. Now, I'm in complete disagreement with him because he's so climate unconscious. And I think that will be the big, dividing line for the coming decades. And it does strike me, though, that if activists and trade unionists put their heads together and say, for a just transition, what are the imports that we can substitute that are solar and wind and storage? And particularly for storage, for storing energy, building small hydropower systems called pumped storage, or maybe having molten salt near concentrated solar. Now, we do import too many solar panels, solar motors, all kinds of things that we really should be building locally, which we once did. Electronics and appliances were all made here before the mid-90s. So I think if the activists out there can put their heads together and call for the just transition to restructure the economy. Listen, what I see is the opposite, because since you're asking about, say, this area of Durban, what I see is more logistics, more tourism, more of the things that make us vulnerable. What kind of vulnerability? Well, for logistics, you saw all those containers. They were stacked up, and they fell over because the water rose. Many of them were empty, and they just completely collapsed and made an enormous mess here, and showed that these logistics parks in the areas, one, for example, a Clarewood racecourse, in these sort of flatlands and low-lying areas, are utterly inappropriate. And the problem is really that Transnet had broken down and trucks began to take these containers. So they set up these new logistics parks, especially all along the highway here, the N2. And so you see the big warehouses, the Mr. Price, and all of these kind of wholesalers that are pulling in, and then they send out to their retail outlets after they unpack and repack from the ships. And that's all on truck. And that obviously should change because it's so irrational to have high carbon intensive trucking.
Can I come in here and just throw this additional question at you? Just as early as yesterday, we understand that the Minister of Transport has suggested a reintroduction of the rail system. Obviously, to transport goods all across the country, free up our highways, make our highways safer. Is that perhaps part of the solution in the country? And how soon can we get this going if we don't have greedy politicians with their hands in the till and tenderpreneurs and all of that? If we get a private sector buy-in, how soon should we and can we get this going?
Well, it should have happened yesterday. In fact, for years, there's been a road to rail policy for Transnet, especially here in the Durban port, because of the enormous congestion, especially on this Solomon Mshlangu, this M7. And it's a very irrational system from the standpoint of carbon emissions because trucks are so much more carbon intensive. So you're absolutely right. It should have been happening. It's been policy. What the problem has been for Transnet, and in a way I appreciate this, and I'm glad about it, because for Transnet, its number one priority has been export of coal. And there's about 78 million tons a year that typically will go out of the country on the Richards Bay line. And now it's down to less than 60. And the reason is people are stealing the cables and stealing the rail line. So obviously, if they're not hiring enough security patrols and have enough cameras, well, you're going to have a lot of theft. And that probably is the single biggest constraint. I mean, I certainly don't think we should be exporting coal. It's part of the climate catastrophe that gave us this Durban rain bomb a month ago. But I do think if you can ask, what would we need from a good government? We see it here because I've just been, visiting around. I was in some of the Islamic areas where gift of the giver has been very impressive in making sure, in fact, the entire area here in Durban, that your gifts are making their way directly to the people who really suffered in this rain bomb. And this is, as you say, Julie, because we have a government, especially here in Durban, you just can't trust. Even the premier, Sikle Zikalala, on the very first day of getting water tankers, he hijacked one for his own place. Now, it's that kind of, let's say, criminality in the state that is actually relatively mediocre, small fry. The really serious dilemma, I think, Julie, is actually not in the state where we rank roughly 70th most corrupt on the Transparency International annual list. You can just check Transparency International. You see South Africa used to be in the 90s about number 25 least corrupt, and now we're 70th. We're 110th out of 180 most corrupt. But our businesses, Julie, usually rank number one, or in the last measure, number two most corrupt. In other words, it's really not at the bottom line here for our economy a problem of state bureaucrats and politicians filching. That's pretty pathetic, mediocre, and trivial. The real problem is corporates. And I'm specifically thinking of the multinationals and some of these big WMC, may I call them, Western multinational corporates, like the Deloittes and the KPMGs. PwC is the group that measures this corporate corruption. I trust them because they've shown they've been, especially with SAA, a very corrupt company. So it takes one to know one. You can check pwc.com, and South Africa has traditionally come up as the number one source of corruption of corporates in the world. That's Sandton and Midrand, it's Umhlanga, it's Stellenbosch and Central Cape Town. Those 5 nodes of big business, they make Pretoria look clean in comparison. So I do think we should be stressing that regulating our companies, especially I would say, Julie, since our companies are on a capital strike, they're not investing. So where are their profits going? And we know the answer, they're going abroad. And this is called illicit financial flows through all manner of tax dodges. One of the great practitioners of this before he became deputy president in 2014 was Cyril Ramaphosa, and his companies, whether that's his own, Shanduka, or the ones he was a key investor in, like MTN, he was the chair, Standard Bank, and especially Lonmin, now Sibanye-Stillwater. They were guilty again and again of this kind of corruption. So I do think let's keep it in perspective. And the dilemma then is, if you've got a very corrupt private sector, what can we do with state assets that would at least rebuild and make life better for people? And I think the quickest answer most people would say is a basic income grant. And there you'd stimulate the economy bottom up, and your small shops, your small producers, maybe your labor-intensive producers of basic needs would then get a boost, as opposed to the vast outflow of money. The one last point about this economy is there's such an orientation to tourism, and yet we're also going to be hit with airline taxes because of the climate crisis. The carbon emitted when we fly is high, and that means the bet that the rulers of the city are taking with a brand new hotel opening up, the Radisson Blue Oceans Umhlanga, or with a big tourism in Daba. And yesterday they announced a new eye on Durban, a Durban eye like the London eye, a huge Ferris wheel. That huge amount of money that goes into the tourism for the elites to attract international visitors, it's really also increasing our vulnerability. It's quite a mistake.
Okay, Professor Patrick Bond is the man I'm talking with this morning regarding the recovery of the South African economy. We are going for an ad break and we will continue thereafter. What I do want to also talk about, Professor, is the Oxford Handbook of the South African economy. What's that all about? And we still have to look into the issue around Toyota coming back into South Africa all the Japanese executive coming to South Africa to do a feasibility study, if they pull out, how much is that going to hurt us? What about Zamazamas and the mining industry? How is that impacting? Or is this just a small group of people who are being further exploited? All of that and more with Professor Patrick Bond right after the ad break.
Smell of black seed oil being applied by my nani. Now I'm using tib black seed in my own home to soothe sniffles and coughs, to help with digestion and immunity, and of course, as part of my beauty routine. After all these years, I've come to appreciate the wisdom in finding comfort and shifa in trusted treatments like tib black seed. You can find tib black seed at all leading pharmacies or find out more at blackseed.co.za.
One of the most important things you can do on this earth is to let people know they are not alone. That the frustration of communities who struggle to earn the very basic is not their cry alone. Discharging your zakah is the starting point for creating a sustainable community and taking action. It's the impetus for creating lasting change and hope. Donate your zakah to the Al-Fida Foundation, supporting over 10,000 Muslim families in the Eastern and Western Cape of South Africa. We need your help to assist our neighbors of need. Contact the Al-Fida Foundation at 041 484 1288 or view or visit our website at www.alfida.co.za. The Al-Fida Foundation, your partner in social investment.
At Sentio, our Invest for Good philosophy is based on a real desire to use our investment skills for the benefit of broader society. We are committed to supporting our community by investing responsibly, giving charitably, and developing talent that will transform the investment industry. As an ethically based asset manager, we are focused on delivering superior risk-adjusted returns for our clients, regardless of market conditions. Visit us at www.sentio-capital.com for more information on our Sharia investment products and start saving with us today. Sentio Capital Management. Invest for good. Sentio Capital Management is an authorized financial services provider.
Listen to something fresh. Listen to Quran Media, your humanitarian broadcaster.
The time is exactly 8:34 a.m. Just before the start of the interview, Professor Bond wanted to know how long this interview is going to run. We are going to ask him to indulge us for a further 5 or 10 minutes more, if you don't mind. He is a Professor of Sociology at University of Johannesburg. He is also a political economist, and we are talking about, hopefully, the revival of the South African economy. Cyril Ramaphosa has said the time of platitudes are over. It's time for work, and to start rolling up our sleeves and getting South Africa back on track. Professor, back to you. I threw out a couple of questions before the ad break. And obviously, you also, in the course of the conversation, spoke about basic social grants, which should continue because that's going to further get the wheels turning as far as the economy is concerned. The other thing that we hear very often from politicians is entrepreneurship. The days of jobs for life at corporates are over. We need to start thinking radically in becoming our own small little business owners or middle-sized business owners. Your thoughts on all of those issues?
Oh yes, I'm all for bottom-up strategy, and you, since you mentioned the Oxford Handbook, I kind of regret it. I've been reading it, and it comes from many of my close colleagues, but they've kind of positioned themselves in the center right to center left without looking at these deeper problems and therefore more structural solutions like a restructured bottom-up approach based on localization and especially on boosting the buying power of the poorest people. You know, we have about 2/3 of the country living on less than 50 rand a day. That's the so-called upper bound poverty line, if you do the calculation properly. And to me, that's really where the opening could be. It would be to have a delinking from the most parasitical processes in the world economy. We're going to be now importing massive inflation through energy, through oil, especially. We're also importing too much food, and food prices have gone up because of this crazy Putin invasion of Ukraine. Now, these are the sorts of things that we should be having more sovereignty. And worst of all, I see too much money flooding out of the country, as I said, and believe it, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana even allowed more capital flight. So if you're a patriotic South African wanting to see the economy grow, you'd be a lot more frustrated with financial parasitism and especially the capital strike by big business. And you'd want more progressive, traditionally socialist strategies to counter that. And unfortunately, our friends at the Oxford Handbook don't really move in that direction enough for my taste. I think, therefore, if we want to look at the sort of low-income folks who particularly are struggling under a debt burden, one of the worst things coming up because of what just happened in Washington this week, the 0.5% increase in the interest rate at the Federal Reserve. And we're going to be seeing that in South Africa, probably 0.5 at the next meeting next month of the Monetary Policy Committee. So those of you in debt, well, you better tighten your belt or get involved in whatever kind of protests that we can generate to reverse these policies.
Okay, I'm kind of thinking, we seem to have a huge problem in the country regarding aging infrastructure. How's that further compounding all of our woes? And just as a final thought, your thoughts on the deal or the supposed deal that we might be undertaking with our Turkish counterparts on the car power ship supplying electricity in the different port cities. So aging infrastructure, how crucial is that for our development going forward? And this whole story around Eskom and wanting to be totally reliant on buying energy from the Turkish company.
Yes, I think you're making such a good point, because that particular deal is so bad that Eskom doesn't want it. It's going to lock in South Africa for more than 200 billion rand for some 15 years. And the company would be basically putting 3 huge ships where they would need to fill the ships in the Richards Bay, the Kucha and the Saldanha harbors with LNG, liquefied natural gas. So to get that gas, again, feeds us into a vulnerability situation into the world economy, where we're going to be then having high greenhouse gas inputs into our exports, which will then attract sanctions. So it's a ridiculous strategy. I think it comes entirely from Gwede and Tosh and their allegations, from competitors at least, that this was a corrupt deal. And you're right, the aging infrastructure is the opportunity. It's a problem, of course, because of the stolen cables, the sabotage of different parts of the network infrastructure, transnet piping, oil pipelines being broken into. Now that does then represent an opportunity to do that rebuilding, and maybe to rebuild much better. For example, to have much more passenger rail instead of the combis that are often very destructive, drive too fast, use too much petrol, and so forth. But also what we could really do with is a labor-intensive rebuilding. That would mean taking these hills of Durban, and hills all over the country that are so vulnerable when we have a rain bomb. And this is, to me, very tragic, having just seen personally the hills of Durban collapse on small houses, say in Springfield or in the shack lands. And this is where most of our 500 compatriots died in KwaZulu-Natal just a month ago. And it would really be building back an infrastructure not only for networks, that is roads, rails, pipelines, and electricity systems, particularly if we can get more decentralized electricity through Eskom, of course, but to do that with solar, with wind, and with storage that's environmentally sound, like pumped storage, hydropower, or molten salt. So lots of big projects. But I would add to that housing and creches. I saw schools and madrasas, all these areas just completely swamped by collapsing banks of rivers, collapsing hills here in Durban. So becoming much more climate conscious and climate proofing, what is sometimes called adaptation of our towns and cities. And that'll also apply to rural areas that are subject in the western part of the country now to sustained drought, or to the locust plague that's come so hard in Eastern Cape and the Karoo because we've had such a long drought beforehand. These are the sorts of things where if we could really get a just transition and put the society's mind into sync, instead of the fantasies of export-led growth and international tourism and continuing to extract minerals, our historic wealth, and sell them for a small pittance and, in a sense, lose our future generations' assets. Those would be the challenges, I think. And unfortunately, aside from, say, the South African Federation of Trade Unions, Alternative Information and Development Center, I would assume the gift of the givers, which understands this in such a concrete way of the need to have very, very sound basic infrastructure. They're building, new boreholes and trying to solve municipalities' water problems here when the city is, basically broken down. And I think that's the challenge for our society, isn't it? To find some really good organizations and join them and build them so we can make some proposals and demand we do things much better. We really genuinely build back better, not in the rhetorical way that our president talks about.
Okay, as a lecturer in sociology, this obviously everything that we've discussed is very close to your heart. My final question and final two questions, and very short, sharp answers to those, if you don't mind, please. We have a huge unemployment situation in the country. Is it doable if we try and upskill those people, the unemployed youth, put them on some sort of a rapid employment, a rapid program, so that they can start working on building up our infrastructure, railways, waterworks, roads, and create the employment? Question number one. Are CEOs, middle and top management being paid way too much as far as the corporate sector is concerned? Should we start leveling the playing fields as far as those salaries and perks and shares are concerned, to again level the playing fields?
Yes, absolutely. Your last question is on target, because what Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana did just a couple of months ago, 3 months ago, was to lower the corporate tax rate, 28 to 27. Don't forget, in 1992, it was 52%. So we've really given the corporates a huge benefit with the hope they'll invest, and they simply haven't. So raising corporate taxes would be one of the strategies, particularly because so much of the wealth that comes into people is through a JSC, through the stock market, which in a sense has just gone through the roof. Do you remember it was about 38,000 2 years ago in 2020? And now something like 68,000, 70,000, it was up to 76,000 the other day. Now that means that the rentiers, the parasitical investors, those who aren't really doing anything, they're getting wealthy. And that's why Johannesburg's the most unequal city in the world, why South Africa is also the most unequal country in the world. And so changing that so that there's less of that parasitical income is absolutely vital. And then I think, as you say, the upskilling, probably it has to come with demand, because if we're not demanding, in a sense, through state programs to make the public works system really work, not at 11 Rand an hour, which is the extended public works, the EPWP minimum wage. It's pathetic, it's tokenistic, but really putting it up properly. And then you're really getting people to get into these training programs, as you say, that we're desperately short of. We used to have such strong artisanal work. And I think a lot of our lack of attention to the lower side of the labor market reflected in, the fourth industrial revolution, which promotes automation and global competitiveness. So it's really time to get back and serve the society. The economy is not doing that now. It needs to do that through the state, because that's the powerful unit. But to get there, obviously, we're going to have to be pushing very hard. And at times you can't trust the state, like delivering flood relief here in eThekwini. So you need the gift of the givers and Abishlali Basim Jindolo and South Durban Community Environmental Alliance instead. It's a tough mix.
I've said it over and over again. We need Wayne Duvenage from Outer and Imtiaz Suleiman from Gift of the Givers to run this country. I've said it over and over again. No one's listening to me. Professor
You
Patrick
think they
Bond.
need to try to get elected if that's their agenda? I don't think it is. I think they're safer where they both are.
Professor Patrick Bond, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Let's put our hands together and pray for common sense to prevail, and let's get this country back on track. What a pleasure talking with you. Till the next time, as always, have yourself a good day.
Likewise. Thank you, Julie.
Bye-bye. 8:47. This is News and Views with me, Julie Ali. We have overrun with our big picture interview for the day, but we did need to uncover some very important elements there. Hope you've enjoyed it. Hope that we have raised the very relevant issues with Professor Patrick Bond. Please stand by. In a minute or two, we are going to be talking with Chairperson of Riverlea Extension 2 Residents Association, and that is Pastor Anthony Sherman, and I think a community member, which is Clint Winnar. So stand by. They have some serious grievances to unpack on the show this morning.